Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, New Orleans made headlines this week, but not in a way we would want, as the national news media reported on the spiraling crime rate. Besides the human tragedies, there was also concern about what the crime was doing to the image of the city. We'll look at that question, as well as our Future Watch section, reporting on big-name events that are leaving or coming, and at a 1990s police reform wave that countered a murder rate that was even higher than now. Elsewhere, we will hear about a new WYES documentary on former Xavier president Norman Francis, as well as some good news for Lakeside Shopping Center. And in this, the week of a royal funeral, a look at times when royalty has touched New Orleans. In our court are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Thanh Truong, reporter, WWL Radio and freelance producer. Stephanie Riegel, staff writer, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. And Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. We'll go over to Stephanie first. And yeah, New Orleans was in the headlines in a national publication, but we really don't want headlines of those kind.
No, it was an article that came out in the Wall Street Journal on the front page, no less, and also was on the top of their website for much of the day. It was the 5th most read story that day, and it proclaimed New Orleans as the murder capital of the world. Quote, "We're in a crisis," and interviewed some small business people and some residents who talked about the very real impact that this is having on the quality of life, on their concerns for, safety. One of the business owners talked about how he had moved out of Orleans Parish. And on the heels of that, the same day, CNN and Fox News both aired very unfavorable stories talking about the recall petition against Mayor Cantrell and some of the political controversies that have fed into that. And of course, this all came right on the heels of confirmation that my colleague at the Times-Picayune broke about Starbucks saying that it's going to close its flagship location in downtown New Orleans on Canal Street because of, quote, safety concerns. So to your point, this is the kind of national attention that we don't want. And this is the kind of thing that really keeps not just media managers and crisis communication people, but economic development officials up at night, because so much about selling New Orleans as a site for companies to come, to expand, to invest, to relocating, and also for the hospitality industry, brand and image is everything. And it just takes a couple of national negative headlines to really put a big black mark on that. And we already struggle. I think the phones were ringing at GNO Inc., the Economic Development Organization, and at New Orleans and Company all weekend. Officials there did tell me, and so they were in damage control mode. Not trying to deny it or downplay it, but trying to frame the publicity in such a way as to say, look, it is a problem. It's not necessarily as bad as it might seem when you're just reading the headlines, but we are on it and we're doing something about it. And I think that's the way they tried to handle it.
Certainly, the economic impact is certainly a concern, because when you get a story like that, it runs counter to all of the marketing efforts that these groups are involved in to get folks to want to come down to New Orleans, to want businesses to come here. But as far as tourism industry, hospitality, they're saying they're not getting convention cancellations or anything like that, right?
Right. And so that's one of the things. I mean, I think there are a couple of things there. For one thing, the stories that I'm alluding to came out late last week, almost a week ago now, right? And so I think it's too soon. People aren't going to just cancel a major event that might not be held for 2 years. Crime goes up and down all the time. And it's a problem all over the country. All major cities are experiencing increases in violent crime, and also in some of the problems that lead to perceptions that a place is dirty and dangerous, unfortunately, like homelessness and vagrancy and things like that. So we're not unique in that. I think, and I could be wrong, but I think the problem is going to be more serious on the economic development side. Because here's the thing, like, the conventions and the visitors' hospitality, they want to come here. There's no place else like New Orleans. But if you're talking about a multi-million or billion-dollar investment in a place to bring a company, to bring employees, you need quality of life, things like good roads, good schools, public education, and safety. And we kind of miss the mark on almost all of them. And great architecture and festivals don't really make up for that. And I think on the economic development side, it's the deals you don't hear about, the places that don't even make the list, don't even make the long list, because the site selectors have ruled us out because we don't have the good schools, we have the criminal justice problems and the bad infrastructure and the climate issues as well.
Are you hearing concern from that, from like a Michael Hecht with GNO Inc.? I know you talked to him.
They do, and of course, they're guarded and they're very sophisticated in their comments to the media, and so I think they like to position things to raise enough of an alarm to try to get the public's attention and to try to affect some change without being too negative. I mean, I don't think Michael Hecht's ever going to say, "Oh my God, we're losing so much business as a result of this," but he wants to let everybody know that we could. Really, it's hard to measure a negative. I don't think we know exactly how much we are losing and missing out on, but I can promise you it's some.
Yeah, just this week, I sell real estate. That's my other world when I don't do television. And I had a very ready buyer who was looking at an almost $2 million condominium who said, you know what? I'm going to hold off on my investment in New Orleans right now. How many of those people are there out there? That's just one client for me, but it's happening across the city, and it's residential, and then it also is those businesses that are choosing not to come right now. Well, maybe I'll go to Texas instead, or maybe I'll go to Atlanta or the beach or wherever else instead. You can't measure, like you said, you can't measure the negatives.
Yeah, and it is certainly, it's a problem, and it's a problem that is recognized and being addressed in different ways, and obviously being recognized by the national media in that way, which was certainly not good news for us. And I know, E, you wanted to talk about that, about efforts in the past in tackling crime problems with the city of New Orleans.
Well, I was just trying to give some perspective that there was a time when the murder number was much higher than it is now. In the early 90s, they were averaging about one murder a day, and beyond, like it was around, in 1994, I believe there were 421 murders. And so what we have is really low. I mean, it's no solace or anything, but there was a time when it was really bad, as it was in other cities around the country. What happened in New Orleans, though, was Mark Morial became mayor, and he did a national search for a police chief. And he came up with a guy named Richard Pennington, who was out of the Washington, D.C. police force. And Pennington, there's a story on his first day, the day he was sworn in, the FBI comes up to him. First of all, there was a murder in which the murderer was a policeman who killed one of his witnesses. And the FBI came up to him and said, "You really got a corrupt police department. There's a bunch of rogue cops in here." This is on his first day, what he was told. But he promised that over time that he'd cut the crime in half. And within a few years he did, that it went to something like 200 and something. Now, the climate nationwide changed too. The economy got better. The crack cocaine thing subsided. There was more federal money that was being put into crime. And so overall things happened. But the biggest improvement during that period of time in the nation was in New Orleans. What Pennington did is he changed the structure. He passed more power down to the precinct commanders, more of what was called community policing, tried to bring the police more involved in the community. Was really, really tough on bad cops. Whereas in the past, they kind of like look past it or look askance. And so he left as so much of a heralded police chief that he ran for mayor. And Mark Morial said it's not that he wanted to run for mayor, the community was demanding that he ran for mayor. He did, but really, he wasn't that great of a politician. He was a better police chief than he was a politician, and lost to Ray Nagin. But just to know that there was this period where it was really, really bad, and it got better. And it's not automatic that it's going to happen, but if you do the right things, and also, whatever the situation, what's going on nationwide is also always going to be part of the story.
All right, E, thanks a lot. And Dawn, I wanted to go over to you because you want to tell us about, Stephanie mentioned the Starbucks on Canal Street. That says it's going to change, it's moving from that location. There are some other instances of businesses or events coming and going.
Right. Starbucks, obviously, big name, big corner where it's no longer going to be. Another big name is Rock and Roll Marathon. The Rock and Roll Marathon happens in cities across the country. People go run in fun destinations and raise money for charities or just go enjoy their time in those cities while they run. This past year's Rock and Roll Marathon in New Orleans got downgraded to a half marathon and also got moved from the French Quarter to the lakefront because they didn't have enough police protection. And I ran it actually, and the routes stunk. It was not fun. There was no great architecture to look at. There were a lot of out and backs. We were told at the time it was because there weren't enough police to protect the route to be in the French Quarter. I have learned this week the event is not coming back to New Orleans. Rock and Roll talked with the stakeholders, the city, the police, and they can't get a route that they want back in the quarter and in the heart of the city. So after the first time since 1965, it used to be the Mardi Gras Marathon, then it turned into the Rock and Roll Marathon 13 years ago, and it just is no more. Don't really know whether it's totally crime and police related or not, or attendance related. Ida and COVID certainly hurt a lot of things. But there is some good stuff coming back. Some things that happened. NOLA by NOLA Music Festival happened last year when Jazz Fest didn't in the fall, and it was so successful, they're bringing it back. It's a music festival that runs from this weekend until October the 9th, and it's live music in bars and clubs across the city. The idea was we want to still have live music even when we couldn't have Jazz Fest. It's back. I'm sure you heard this week it was announced that the Miss Universe pageant is coming to New Orleans. It hasn't been in New Orleans, at least in the last 50 years, if it's ever been. It's been in Las Vegas and in Hollywood, Florida, and Maui. But it brings in 90 contestants from 90 different countries around the world. It's broadcast to more than 500 million people, so in 165 countries. So the city really has a chance, hopefully, to shine. New Orleans and Company says they will be working with that pageant to make sure that the people who come in go to the right places and the right events are showcased. And the city really, you cannot pay for that kind of advertising, obviously. So there's good news happening there. The American Association of Anesthesiologists is coming back to the city. We touched on this a little bit with Stephanie. New Orleans and Company is fighting an uphill battle right now. They say they've answered the phone a lot this week, but they haven't had anybody canceling yet. But it's a publicity problem for sure right now to say, sure, come on and bring your people in, and they'll be safe for a weekend. You'd like to be able to say, bring them in and they'll be safe and they may want to move here and your company may want to move here too. But Beignet Fest is back this weekend. The National Fried Chicken Festival is coming. The Crew of Boo Parade is rolling. So there are signs that things are starting to turn around. We weren't just hit by COVID like the rest of the country and the crime rate like the rest of the country, but Ida really did do a number on all of our events and visitors. In 2019, we had a record-breaking year with 19 million people visiting the city of New Orleans, spending an estimated $10 billion. 2020 was on track to be even bigger than that. Obviously, it wasn't because of Ida. 2021, just with the Delta surge, the Omicron surge, and Ida, was definitely on a downturn. And now it's looking like 2022 isn't quite to that level that 2019 was, but definitely the trajectory is in the right direction. So if we can get a handle on the headlines and also the crime that goes with those headlines, the news could be brighter than it currently is.
I know. Headlines are one thing, but the reality is the other, and what's happening is that's the biggest concern. Okay, thanks a lot, Dawn. All right, we're going to go over to Dawn right now, because Dawn has produced for WYES a wonderful documentary that we're going to premiere this coming Tuesday at 8 o'clock here on WYES about the wonderful Norman C. Francis. So we're going to talk to Dawn about that, but first let's take a look at a little clip from it.
Having had limited schooling of their own, Joseph and Mabel Francis made education a priority for their children.
He grew up with two parents, and as he always said, who really only had a third-grade education, but taught him everything he needed to know in life, and that is having faith in God, being kind, and also getting a solid education.
Around the age of 6, while living in the segregated South, the future university president learned one of his most important life lessons.
I was standing on the back porch with my mother, and I saw my dad with other men around the neighborhood. There were about 5, and they were building this box. And I said, Mama, what are they doing, building this box? Oh, they say, you know your little friend who was white? Down the street, you play ball with him with the other kids? Yeah. He said, his daddy died, your mother didn't have money, so those men got together and built a coffin. That never left me. And they said they're gonna take care of whatever they could. So that religious part of understanding human beings, appreciating what they are, color didn't matter, you were human.
And Ton, the piece is really such a good documentary. We had a preview of it here the other night and had an audience here, really enjoyed it. And Dr. Francis was in the audience, and he seemed to like the story about him pretty well, too. What a fantastic person. So just tell us more about the doc and also your personal experience with it.
Well, first, I got to say, when the screening took place with the Francis family and obviously with Dr. Francis in the audience, that was the toughest, but I would say the most important audience that we needed to have.
Yeah.
So a lot of us were holding our breaths for a moment, certainly throughout the documentary, but I think at the end, I believe they gave us 2 thumbs up. So,
I think so.
yeah.
I think so, absolutely.
But I think that clip really encapsulates what I find fascinating about Dr. Francis. When you take a look at the comic book heroes of this time, and certainly the movies that a lot of children are fascinated with, some of the more interesting parts of those stories are the origin stories. How a person, how a superhero, how a superstar of the university system is how one person described Dr. Francis, how they became who they became. And I think that moment when he was a 6-year-old child and his father was building a coffin for a white child, and the context of that, too, understand that he was living in the segregated South in Lafayette at the time. So when he saw that as an example of what people need to do in times of crisis, in times of need, he used that as his North Star throughout his life, and that formed his worldview. So I think as people will watch this documentary, they will see how he applied that humanity, that need for leadership, that need for compassion throughout his life, but some of the most critical points of New Orleans history as well, during the Civil Rights era, certainly during the rebuild of New Orleans after Katrina,
right,
and all of Louisiana during and post Hurricane Rita as well. And so for me, I got to know another facet of a man that I think we could easily overlook because he's almost everywhere throughout history in New Orleans. But as you dig deeper into his backstory, you realize that he has been advisors to presidents, he has hosted the Pope, but more so, I think people will see the more human side of his story when we hear from his families and some of his friends as well, that he had a sense of humor and he's quite a person.
Indeed, you do get the human side of him, but also you do really focus on, and the viewer comes away with an understanding of what a leader he has been, an important leader to this community.
Absolutely, and I think that the people that have always tapped him to be a chairperson of the Louisiana Recovery Authority, how he led Liberty Bank to be what it is today, starting as a black-owned bank to flourishing, to allowing communities that are generally disadvantaged and cut off from pathways to finances and opportunities, to even assisting in bringing the New Orleans Saints to here.
Right.
There are so many moments that not just him being present, but there have been so many people that sought him out to be the leader.
Right.
And too often I think that we may see the outcome of an event and say, wow, what a magnificent thing to have taken place. We rarely see the people that have organized and led and made that moment possible. And even though Norman Francis wasn't always visible for the outcome, he was always there, and I think people will be fascinated to see what he's done behind the scenes.
That outcome happened because he was behind it. It's a great piece, Tom. Congratulations on it.
Oh, I'm happy to be part of it.
Thanks a lot. Let's now go on back over to Stephanie. And, we're hearing bad news, economic impact, et cetera, but there was some good news for Lakeside Shopping Center.
Yeah, absolutely. Did a piece yesterday or earlier this week about Lakeside Shopping Center and some new tenants that they have. Of course, all shopping centers and malls experience turnover, but Lakeside has a new restaurant coming, a Habaneros, a new menswear store called Psycho Bunny, which is a very popular national brand with trendy young men. And Lee Michaels is building a new freestanding store on an out parcel where Red Lobster, y'all probably remember it anytime you drive down Causeway, was. And there have been several other very successful tenants that have opened up there in just the past 3 or 4 months. And I think especially like the Lee Michaels investment shows, and this is a major investment for them. It's their most expensive store of all their 9 locations across 7 states. And it shows that a company like that, a high-end jeweler, has a lot of confidence in that market. It's very healthy, and it also, I think, speaks to the health of Jefferson Parish as a retail destination. Of course, Lakeside is a super regional mall. It's over 1 million square feet, so people do travel from like a roughly 75-mile radius to shop there. So it has that going for it, and super regional malls tend to do better than some of the smaller or aging properties in this era of online shopping. But it is, as you mentioned, a bright spot and something not to be overlooked.
And also, there's Lakeside itself. We hear of malls dying all across America, but there's Lakeside. It's doing really well.
It's doing really, really well. I'm not sure exactly what the performance statistics are, but I know it's a very, very high-performing mall. And part of the thing is shopping is never going to go away. And so if a mall has good management, gets the right tenant mix, and can give the shoppers an experience, they're going to want to come, engage, have a fun experience, maybe try on something. They're still going to buy out of convenience online, and those numbers are growing more and more. Over the past decade, online shopping has increased 5-fold, and it's up about 55% just since the pandemic. But you can't replace trying on an engagement ring. You don't want to do that online. You want to try on a pair of shoes. Thank you very much. Or makeup. You want to see what it really looks like in real life. And then, like, one of the new stores is called Vine and Tap. It's a locally owned wine bar where you can get your wine to go and walk around the mall with your wine and shop and sip at the same time. So that's what I mean by experiential.
Right, and it's a social experience too.
Exactly.
And people still want to do that. So, all right, Lakeside, we're happy for Lakeside. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. Hey, let's go on over to you. New Orleans and its brushes with royalty.
Well, this is the week of the royal funeral. It just made me think about royalty in New Orleans. New Orleans is rushes. We have our own make-believe royalty, of course, with Mardi Gras, but there have been times when there have been real royalty in town, including one related to Mardi Gras. In 1872, which just happened to be the day of the first Rex Parade, the Grand Duke Alexis was in town. He didn't come to town because of that. He was making a nationwide tour, but he came in town, he saw the parade, and it really kind of legitimized Rex. It was like real royalty acknowledging this new king of Carnival. He was in his family's dynasty, he was fourth in line of succession, so he probably wouldn't have made it, at least not before the Russian Revolution, but he was legitimate royalty. In 1950, a former king, came to town, and that was Edward, Duke of Windsor, who had been King Edward VIII. And this is the famous story of the king who resigned because of the woman he loved. And that was Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The Church of England rules were that you couldn't have a divorce and be king. And so he resigned, but they did a tour. They came around, and there was that famous event when they went to the Rex Ball and they bowed to the Rex King and Queen. In 1953, King Paul and Queen Frederica of Greece came to New Orleans for reasons I'm not sure, but they had a big gala at the Antoine's, and then in a really interesting story, we know the story about Princess Grace and meeting Prince Rainier and getting married, and she left being a movie star to be the Princess of Monaco. But we had that story in New Orleans with a woman named Alice Heine, whose family had European connections, but who was raised in the French Quarter. And once the Civil War came, the family moved to Europe. And during that process, she met a guy named Alfred, who was the Prince of Monaco, and she wound up marrying him. And so years before Princess Grace, we had somebody from New Orleans who was the Princess of Monaco. And then finally, the year Pope John Paul came here, John Paul was sort of like a monarch. It was the same sort of royal trappings, and he ruled over a political division, being Vatican City. He ruled over an army, being the Swiss Guard, but he also just had a lot of personality to it. And so that was kind of treated almost as a royal event also.
You know, I've noted to you before we did the show that I saw something posted, and this was on social media, about, at the time, Prince Charles visiting New Orleans after Katrina, taking a look at our recovery efforts. And the sources that posted it were pretty reliable sources. You didn't have any memory of that?
I don't recall that. And I doubt if he came all the way from England just because of that. He must have been in the neighborhood, but it was good of him to come by. Also wanted to mention that in 2018, for the tricentennial, the King of Spain and the Queen of Spain came by. Now, I remember that night I was watching television, I was watching the news, and he said, the King and Queen of Spain were in town tonight. I didn't even know Spain had a King and Queen, much less come to town. It was really kept secret. And they had a dinner, and the next day they went to San Antonio, which was also celebrating its tricentennial.
All righty, E, thanks a lot. We're going to stick with you for other stories.
Okay, I'm going to do something a little bit different, okay, because if I may vent a peeve, okay, I thought that guy from Starbucks, the CEO, was way out of line to blame the city in so many different ways. Every city's got crime, but to also say, well, there's mental health problems and there's racism problems. And he's from Seattle, okay? I mean, Seattle has riots in the streets, has a huge murder rate problem. And I just thought it was really unfair to New Orleans to do that. I mean, he could have just said, you know, there's issues here, but being from Seattle, and plus, we got better coffee than Seattle does, too. So.
Indeed we do. Dawn, let's go to you.
Speaking of events coming back, Gretna Heritage Festival is now making a comeback this year. It's October 7th to the 9th, so just be on the lookout. Your calendar can be very full with events this
All right.
fall.
Ton?
Well, I'm hoping that everybody will tune in on Tuesday, 8 o'clock, to watch the Legacy of Norman Francis. It's Dr. Norman C. Francis, A Legacy of Leadership, that will be airing right here on WYES. And it'll also be streaming on the WYES and the PBS app, so please tune in for that. I think it'll be a great moment for the family of Dr. Francis, but also to learn more about the history and how he has played a major role in some of the pivotal moments of the city.
And enjoy a good documentary, 8 p.m. Stephanie, over to you.
Well, New Orleans isn't the only city that's experiencing crime problems, as Errol mentioned. And of course, in Baton Rouge, police are trying to solve the murder of an LSU student who was literally just gunned down in her car. It was very late at night after being out with friends, and she was stopped at a railroad crossing. And so, it just sort of underscores how this is going on everywhere, but it affects the whole state, too, and another black eye for us.
I know, heartbreaking. All right, guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for watching. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.